Morning, everybody. Hope we've had a great break and everybody's come back nice and refreshed and woken up with a little bit of coffee in them. My name's Wardell. I'm a solutions engineer at a company called Abnormal Security. Some people in the room may have heard of us, some of you may not. What we really are an email security vendor that's revolutionizing the way that we actually look at this space, this industry, and the problems that we face. So the first thing to understand really is what is the email threat landscape? For years, people have been talking about email security. Email is the number one threat vector. Emails will always be getting into your organization and impacting end users. But if we look at how this has shifted over time, what we're looking at now is really the kind of emergence and the resurgence of BEC, so business email compromise, and email account compromise. And these two factors are really the important thing that's driving the malicious actors' monetary gain. When we look at the stats, and these are coming out of the FBI, around what is the monetary impact of BEC, invoice fraud, social engineering, it's only going up and up and up. These kind of attacks are really kind of nefarious in the way they work and the way they're looking for that monetary aspect. So this could be invoice fraud, this could be people being phished and then their account being compromised again to use for monetary gain. So these kind of attacks are the ones that are really getting past traditional security mechanisms. So which types of attacks should we be worrying about? Obviously, we all know about ransomware, malware, spam, the kind of low-hanging fruit and the easy-to-detect kind of email attacks. But actually, there's two real camps of email that we want to look for. One of those is the inbound email attack, and those are things like the BEC, supply chain compromise, compromised third-party accounts, and payloadless emails and ransomware. But the other side of this is the email platform itself. So people coming after your 365 environment directly, people doing account takeovers, people looking for MFA bypass, either that through social engineering, through MFA storms. We now know that those techniques and those security mechanisms aren't infallible. So when we look at that and we break it down, we're really looking at these kind of two pieces. The first one being those email attacks and the inbound email itself. So this is probably the easiest thing, and this is what a lot of the legacy solutions have been built out to do. Historically, I've worked at other email security vendors, and they were very good for the period they were in at finding malware, finding spam, and looking for threat intelligence-based detections. But they aren't really the only types of email threats we now need to be worrying about. And then when we flip it on its head and look at the actual email platform itself, 365 is a huge attack surface. And when we combine the two, that's really where you need an email security platform that's actually going to look at both sides of this stack. How do we defend against emails that are both coming inbound, but also then the follow-on compromising of email accounts and the compromised risk that then exposes. So when we look at these, I've got a couple of examples I just want to step through, and these are really kind of indicative of the emails that we see day in, day out, getting past your legacy email solutions. So the first one, and apologies, the text is probably quite small on this, but in essence, this is an email that says, look, I'm a lawyer from this third-party legal firm. Can you please pay this outstanding debt that you have? It carries a lot of gravitas. It's coming from a legal firm. And actually, when we start drilling into it, we start looking at what's the intention of that message. The intention is to get an engagement with a finance team that is then going to go out and they're going to pay an invoice potentially fraudulently off the back of it. When we look at this, what we can actually see, though, is that actually this is a spoofed and a typo-squatted domain. And we see this with almost all of the big legal firms in the UK. We've seen examples of all of their emails being typo-squatted, compromised, and then coming through with a different name attached to them. So in this case, we're obviously looking at Sullivan Cromwell, but actually the email address is sullivancromwells@.com, which again, at a quick glance, and if you're not in that kind of industry, might be something that would alert you and raise a flag. The interesting thing about this is it's actually come from a legitimate named person at that legal firm. So impersonation is a really key tactic that malicious actors are going for. Also, when we build this out, malicious actors are going to the extent of checking and creating SPF records, making sure that all their emails are going to pass SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. So if you were reliant upon things like ValueMail and doing checking of authentication against emails, that again isn't necessarily enough to defend against these types of attack. That domain was actually created on the 9th of January this year, and that attack was launched on about the 10th or 11th of January. So these things get stood up, authentication stood up with them, and they get stood up very, very quickly and then stood down. So if you're reliant on looking for known bad, it's going to be impossible to find some of these things. When we actually look at what that email was sending through, again, we've actually seen the piece where somebody's looking for engagement, and in this instance, we actually saw somebody engaging with it. So somebody from that finance team replied to this, said, look, yep, can you send me the PO? We'll get that processed as soon as possible. So whilst there's a lot of training and everything in place for organizations, users, again, aren't infallible. People will fall for this stuff. Some of this stuff is so well crafted that actually it'd be almost impossible for you to detect every single one of these that comes in. The second example we've got is, again, coming from a real email address. So this is actually a credential harvesting attack. The emails come in, the body just says FYI, and there's an attachment on this email. When we actually open up the attachment itself is a really, what looks like a malformed web page. So we've got an error code, failed to load PDF document, and there's a reload option in there. The weird thing is, when you actually click that reload option, the email was crafted to look like this. The reload option actually then prompts a Microsoft 365 login page, populated automatically with that user's email address. So when you start looking at this as an end user, it's very believable that this could be a place that you've been taken to. I've seen these recently where people have even gone to the extent of putting the legitimate background image behind the 365 box that a user would be presented with in the real world. So these ones are very difficult to spot. This one's actually also come from a legitimate email address, so it's come from a compromised third party. And again, we see an increasing amount of supplier chain and compromised accounts coming into an organization, building on existing levels of trust that somebody might already have with them. So what do we do about it? And this is the kind of next step of this and the evolution of how we should look at email security. There's kind of 7 things we need to look for. The first of those is the legacy approach of putting something in the mail flow itself was very much looking at internal only or inbound only traffic. What we want to look for is an API-driven solution. So let's integrate via the API into 365 or into G Suite. And let's make sure that we can actually then see internal traffic as well. That east-west email traffic is as important as that inbound to inside traffic. The reason being, once an account has been compromised, we'll start to see internal phishing attacks. We'll start to see internal invoice fraud. And these are really common attacks that we see with customers every day. The other thing that we see when we're looking at an API approach is we can actually ingest all of the information. So instead of just seeing what comes in a single email, we can ingest things like sign-in details. We can see who normally would interact with who in the organization. We can see what's somebody's role in the organization from Active Directory. Is it normal that a cleaner is emailing the CFO? Is it normal that the CFO is emailing the legal team directly and saying, let's get this PO signed off straight away? Those are the kind of things that the API opens up to us. The other piece is understanding supply chain attack. Commonly now, a lot of bigger organizations have invested so much in security, they're a really unattractive target to a malicious actor. They know that you've got defenses in place that are going to stop them getting in. So what they're going to do is they're going to go for the 5-man band that empties your bins. They're going to go for the smaller company that they can then go and compromise to utilize them as a route into you. When you receive an email from a company you know, there's an intrinsic level of trust with that. Once that email lands in your mailbox, you're far more likely to engage with it if it's come from a real person that you've previously emailed. So compromised accounts in the supply chain are really important. So what we want to understand is, what does normal look like from that behavior? Do you often email that third-party company? Do they email you? What day do invoices arrive? Do they arrive on a Saturday every week? Do they arrive on a Monday? And what we can gain from that is then an understanding of what happens when that expected behavior doesn't occur. Is that an abnormal kind of threat that we're looking for? The next piece we want to look at is taking a risk-adaptive approach to detection. Very historically, a lot of the ways we would look at this would be very much a kind of block list, allow list. We would have signatures for malware payloads. We would have signatures for URLs that we knew were bad. But actually, a lot of the modern-day attacks are arriving as text only. So what we need to understand is, how do we interpret that, and how do we turn that into a meaningful bit of learning for the tooling? So what we can do, we want to look for natural language processing. We want to look for that understanding of what's the intention of a message. What is somebody trying to achieve and to do with that message? And that's a really important factor when we've got these text-only, payloadless emails. What that allows you to do is really understand and adopt a kind of posture where you can go and say, well, actually, why would somebody be reaching out directly to our HR or payroll team from a personal email address asking for their account details to be changed? That's a really suspicious behavior. But actually, there's nothing malicious in it. It's just a little bit of text. So we need to understand that. The next piece is really understanding automation and making sure we can actually remediate things. A lot of the pressure on SOC teams and email teams is having to go proactively hunting down some of these emails that have landed in the organization. We don't want to rely on the end user having to report something that looks suspicious, then go and find it, then go and remediate out of the 100 mailboxes it's also sat in. We want to make sure that we can actually do automated remediation of a lot of this work. So what we want to look for is, let's remove the threat straight away. As soon as it lands, make a determination. Is that a bad email? If it is, take it straight out of the user's inbox. We don't want the idea of quarantining or anything else. If I hand somebody a plate and say, careful, that is hot, first thing somebody does is touch it. If you're in a scenario where somebody's emailed you with a quarantine email and say, okay, look, you've received this email, are you sure you want that? First thing a user's going to do is say, yes, I want to have a look at that email. So making sure that we can automate the remediation process is really important. The second piece of this is, let's take the task off of the SOC team having to remediate email. What we want to do is be able to automatically rescan anything that a user reports, work out if that's actually now malicious, and if it is, automatically clean that up. One of the other key things, and this is where we look at the expanded kind of attack surface, is let's work out when we've got a compromised internal account. An internal compromised account is as dangerous as an email coming in. So understanding, okay, what is a user doing in this account? Is it a too fast to travel login that's indicated that? Is it a atypical location for the user to sign in? There's a number of factors we want to look for, and this is where some of the other platforms like Microsoft do a good job of working out, is a user logging in from an atypical location? But that in itself tends to be quite noisy because actually you're going to trigger that with VPNs or when people go on trains and so on. What we want to do is combine that intelligence with email intelligence to say, okay, is there a mail filter rule that's been created? Has somebody set a rule that deletes all of that user's mail or hides email coming from certain mailboxes or with certain subject lines? And we see that really commonly with things like PayPal attacks and so on, where they'll create a rule that automatically moves that email to junk. So understanding that kind of risk profile for the user account is really important. Not necessarily so much in the way of security, but we'd also like a tooling that can actually drive productivity in the user base, especially in the current economic climate where constraints on new hiring and so on are really impacting kind of workforces. Making sure we can get the most out of people at the same time is really critical. So making sure that they're not dealing with grey mail is paramount. And when we say grey mail, what we're talking about is you've all come to an event today, people will take your badge number, you'll get spammed with email, inevitably from vendors like the one I work at. But what you deem to be grey mail is that kind of advertising or the mailing list type mail. Users will spend so much of their time reading through just noise. And what we want to be able to do is actually automate the remediation of that, put it into a folder where the user doesn't necessarily see it straight away. They have to go drilling in if they want to go and look for these newsletters. We've seen examples of organizations where they're spending hours and hours and hours every week as an entire workforce just churning through noisy email. And then the last part of this is the platform itself. So how do we look for the activities that somebody does with a compromised 365 administration account? Once somebody's compromised an account, if it's a normal account, yeah, they can use it to send email. That's bad. We can obviously drive invoicing fraud and similar with that. But actually, if they compromise an admin account, they can go into 365 and they can start adding applications. They can start doing other types of activity. EA was a really prime example of that, where somebody got in, installed an application that was essentially just forwarding emails out of their 365 environment. So they're really good indicators of something bad is happening here. So being able to then go and automate the cleanup of that and understand what does the risk posture in that platform look like is paramount. So what does that? And I don't think there's going to be any surprises. Abnormal really kind of ticks all those 7 boxes. So when we look at how we operate, we are a kind of Microsoft strategic partner. We also partner very closely with Google. And we can actually utilize the API from both those companies. So the Graph API from Microsoft or the Google API to link into the mailbox. And actually we'll scan email in situ. So when the email is sat in there, we'll scan that. And we'll scan it with a different kind of lens on it to how a traditional email vendor would have probably done this. So if we look at how we go about detecting it, essentially it boils down to 3 pillars of detection for us. Identity is a really good indicator of whether or not an email is suspicious. Who is the sender? Who is the recipient? Is the sender logging in from a Gmail account? Is it coming from a newly registered domain? Is it coming from a geolocation that we wouldn't expect it to come from that organization? And from a recipient point of view, who's receiving this email? Does this person normally receive emails asking for financial details? Does this person normally receive emails from the CFO internally? So identity is really important in understanding that. And that also then obviously extends to vendors and those third parties in that supply chain. Does the supply chain normally email on certain days? What's the tone of the email? And so on. We then look at behavior. So what does a relationship between these people look like? Who normally emails who? And that actually ties very closely with content, as I'll explain in a minute. But what we're really looking at is kind of frequency. We're looking at times of day that people would normally email. We're looking at kind of who would normally email who. But actually, we can do an element of intelligence sharing in the background, which is looking at supply chain graphs. So we understand that certain companies have got compromised email accounts in them. Almost certainly all of the big four, all of the banking email addresses will have compromised accounts within them. So let's understand, are you receiving emails from a potentially risky domain? Are they domains where there's likely to be compromised emails coming from there? And do we need to check those emails with a little bit more scrutiny as we go forwards? And then content analysis. So historically, you would think content analysis is, let's see if the attachment matches a signature. When we hash it, what is it? But for us, content is that, but it's also, let's look at the actual language in the email. What is the intention of it? What's the malicious actor trying to gain from tweaking the text in there? So this is where we're looking for things like, can you change my bank details? Can you process this PO? We're looking into the even depths of, is there a sentiment of urgency in there? How does this email user normally communicate? Are they formal? Are they informal? Do they sort of normally start an email with hi or dear this person? And that's the kind of level of intelligence that we're going to look into these emails with to understand, is that really coming from a legitimate user? And once we tie that all together, that's when we'll deem this to be anomalous detection. And once we've looked at that kind of sequence of events and that sequence of detections, we can say, yep, bad email, let's automatically remediate that, pull that out of the user's mailbox and move it off to a location where the user can't interact with that anymore. So if we look at those 2 examples from earlier, how do we detect those? That first example where it's come from the legal party, what we actually see when we pull this together, we can tie it actually back to the Crimson Snakes group. So when we started to do the analysis into this, we can understand where the malicious acting group was, but we'll pull it together to be BEC. Obviously, we would remediate that in the real world, but the reasons that we come to this conclusion, if the slide ever builds out, is a number of factors. It's an unusual sender. We've never seen that sender emailing that user before. We know the language in that email is looking for financial engagement, and we can actually see that the domain itself was registered within less than a year, which again is a really suspicious kind of activity. So once we tie all these pieces together, none of them should ever be deterministic, but as a collection, they really tell a story that this is a bad email. And the way we want to present that to an administrator is very simple. We want it to be spelt out, look, this is the reason this is a bad email, just to make that life easy for kind of email admins. That second example, the credential phishing one, again, there's a good story that we can build behind this. When we pull it together, again, it's an unusual sender. There's actually an uncommon attachment type. The user had never received a HTML attachment before. That, again, not deterministic. It could be something completely benign. But we tie it all together, and we can see that within the attachment there's actually then that financial, or the phishing request. So we can see there's a credential harvesting page that's then being presented once you go through that reload page. So we're pulling all of that information together and that intelligence to build out the story and, again, present that back to an admin so they can understand what's going on. And, again, in the real world, would have remediated that. So that's kind of who Abnormal are. And I guess the takeaway from this is what we can deliver for you, and if you want to come and have a speak with us, we can go into this in more depth. We offer a kind of risk assessment service. Because we're only plumbing in via the API, we can actually turn this on in sort of 5 to 10 minutes. We'll authenticate into G Suite or into 365 using the API. What it'll do then is it'll actually do a retrospective look back at what's in your mailboxes today. what does your existing threat look like? And then we'll continue that process for a couple of weeks so you can understand what does live data look like in your environment as well. Are you still receiving malicious email? What can we do about that? And that's a really good way of understanding what does your risk footprint look like. It's very easy to understand today you're only seeing user-reported email or an email when it goes really wrong and something actually gets compromised. So we can look for those pieces, pull it all together, and then present you back those findings. So if anybody would like to find out more about that, feel free to come find us. We'll be in the main room over lunch. So at this point, open the floor to any questions. Yep.
So does the solution also offer things like defang wizard that URL links put in to stop the user from block?
Yeah, sure. So for those at the back, the question was around defagging sort of URLs, making sure that they can't be clicked through. So the way we kind of look at that, typically we'll be sat behind 365 or another secure email gateway. What we'll tend to see is a user will be using secure links for that, or safe links for that. We have a confidence level in the email the sort of remediation that we're doing that we don't need to do that piece. Our efficacy is arguably one of the highest in the market, so we won't do the kind of defanging piece. We'll be reliant on safe links doing that bit for us.
Does it plug into any RMM tools that your API work with?
Sorry, RM tools?
Using an RMM tool already in your organization.
Mm-hmm.
You said there's an API that you use.
Yep.
Is there conflicts between using those sort of tools and your API?
No, so the way we grab the API, as long as the email is in the inbox, we don't really care about what else is connected to 365 or G Suite. We'll just only be reliant on picking out the emails that are hitting the inbox for us. Oh, yep.
So, my SOC team are fed up with false positives, so does yours try to play for the AI, so does it learn from the false positives?
Yeah, so for anybody that didn't hear, it's about a question about false positives. For us, a false positive is obviously a bad thing. We have a really low false positive rate, but the way we're gaining that is actually through feedback from users. So there's a full 360 feedback mechanism in the tool where if you found a false positive, you report that to us. Unlike other vendors where I've worked, we'll actually then come back to you and say, look, thanks for reporting that. We've taken this action to change the modeling in the background. We wouldn't find that email again. But we give you that full kind of analysis on why we found it the first time and then how we've gone about changing the modeling to make sure we don't pick that up in the future. Any other questions at all?
Do you prevent the malware or getting into the mailbox, or does it have to arrive in the mailbox and then you can do the remediation?
Yeah, so the mail will hit the mailbox. Within 0.2 of a second, we'll make a determination on if that email is bad or not. And then within the second, we'll have pulled that mail out. So the user won't have been able to open any macro-enabled document or do any of the bits that would trigger off the malware. Oop, yep. Yes, that's a good question. For us, when we're looking at the kind of building out the modeling, we obviously have a lot of intelligence from previous customers and other engagements that we've got. So we build out the models based on previous engagement and other open source kind of threat intelligence that we can gather. But then once we've got that, we'll actually build the models, and then some of it will be specific to you, some of it will be coming from the wider kind of pool of what we know. Any other questions at all? Perfect. So hopefully you found that useful. Like I say, be out in the thing over lunch if anybody wants to come and have an in more depth chat about what we do. Thanks very much.